a very important piece of legislation that we'll be talking about in the coming hours. And also the establishment of the local content department of the Commission. Now, in that role, she championed a strategic approach to local content development and enforcement in the Jubilee, the TEN, and OCTP projects. She was a senior legal counsel at the Ministry of Energy and Petroleum here in Ghana, advising on a broad spectrum of legal issues in the energy sector, including the review of Ghana's petroleum legislation. She has also worked in a number of senior positions in Juliet Chumesi Anoche. He is a principal consultant, Anajul Efriye & Co. Madam, thank you very much for agreeing to chair this great occasion.
Thank you so much, and sorry, I've just dropped my pen there, but that's fine. Thank you. Thank you so much, and thanks to ASEP for the opportunity to chair the opening session and to also set the tone for this year's summit. Before I sit down and the program proceeds, I have just very few remarks that I needed to make, just to, of course, set us on a path for what we're going to be doing here for the next 2 days. I take this opportunity to welcome Your Excellency, the Honorable Mr. John Peter Amewu, who is our current Minister of Energy, Ghana. I understand that we also have certain distinguished heads of diplomatic missions in Ghana who are also present. You're welcome. I also want to welcome the Honorable Dr. Mohammed Amin Adam, the Deputy Minister of Energy, with responsibility for petroleum, for the petroleum sector, and also the founder and the former executive director of the African Center for Energy Policy, ASEP, under whose watch this summit was birthed. We have with us the Honorable Dr. Aro Abdul Rahman, who is the former Minister of Petroleum and Gas of the Republic of Sudan. We have with us Honorable John Monye, EGH, who is a Cabinet Secretary, Ministry of Petroleum and Mining in Kenya. So as you can see, it's a very august and international summit that we're having here. I also want to extend a very good morning to our distinguished regulators, titans of oil and gas and mining companies who are here, civil society organizations, my fellow panelists, discussants. Welcome to the Labadi Beach Hotel, the very salubrious Labadi Beach Hotel. As you can see, the sea is on our right-hand side and is a lovely place. This event is an annual event which brings together all the key stakeholders in Africa's petroleum industry to deliberate on emerging governance issues in the sector. After me is coming the Executive Director of ASEP, so I will not walk you through the history of the summit. I think he's a better placed person to tell you where we have been. But safe to make the point that this summit traveled through the near apocalypse of the horsemen of low oil prices in 2017, when we thought the world was coming to an end. And even then, the summit still kept going on. This year, why are we here? Local content for me is something that makes me very excited. And believe you me, since last night I couldn't sleep. You might think that's very sad. But I couldn't sleep because I was so excited about a summit once again that would give us the opportunity to talk about local content. It seems to be the only topic I talk about all the time. So this year, brace yourself. The summit is going to be dealing with local content. In particular, increasing the impact of local content policies in resource-rich African economies and harnessing the potential of local content for economic growth. A very topical and emotive issue. I'm sure you will agree with me. Africa's local content has traveled a long journey, notwithstanding the vociferous objections from the various insidious naysayers. and the modern doomsday Sanballat and Tobiases, as in the biblical Nehemiah's time, Africa's drive for increased local content marches on relentlessly. Surprisingly, some of the chief opponents, and I hope there are none of them in this room today, of local content and critics of local content implementation in Africa are from countries which are known to have benefited immensely from local content in the past. Talk about double standards. Moreover, local content is also not restricted to the natural resources sector, but runs across a broad spectrum of industries. Time will fail me if I'm to list the number of countries who have implemented local content or in the areas that local content has been implemented. But safe to say, just to mention a few, we all remember President Barack Obama's notoriously protectionist Buy American policy. This was under the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act of 2009. There is also the Canadian Green Energy and Green Economy Act in 2009. And in India, we have the Indian Jawaharlal Nehru National Solar Mission. They are all examples of local content policies writ large. Our Chinese friends, we're very fond of the Chinese in Africa. Our Chinese friends, not to be outdone, they have also come up with policies and initiatives aimed at promoting in-country capacity and indigenous technical expertise. Similar to our legislation, a number of Chinese government programs require formation of joint ventures between foreign investors and Chinese companies and technology transfer in return for preferential treatment in the Chinese market. The automotive sector, not to be outdone, is also riddled with local content restrictions, with countries including Thailand and Vietnam having stringent targets in this area. Interestingly, and this is for telenovela aficionados, local content requirements are also present in the radio, film, and television industry. Currently, Amazon and Netflix are under increasing pressure to accede to proposals to reserve some video streaming services or allocate a percentage of their catalogs to European content. Honorable Minister, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, notwithstanding the commendable successes in local content implementation in other jurisdictions, unfortunately, in our Jerusalem, Africa, like the proverbial bad smell, the specter that local content is believed to create market inefficiencies and market distortions linger like Charles Dickens's famous Ghost of Christmas Past. Clearly, however, Honorable Minister, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, as evidenced as far back as the work in 1950s by the eminent Rasmussen, Chinnery, and Watanabe, the oil and gas sector exhibits measurable linkages which can be harnessed through effective implementation of local content strategies for the development of competitive local industries. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, as we sit through the various erudite presentations and panel discussions of this two-day summit, we must bear in mind the following. The aims of local content have evolved over the years from creation of forward and backward linkages to include wider economic diversification beyond its primary oil and gas sector. Secondly, we can achieve such diversification in Africa if linkages between the primary oil and gas sector and other sectors are strong. And lastly, Africa can only achieve optimum local content and participation through effective partnerships with all stakeholders, in particular industry. Honorable Minister, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, this summit is structured into keynote speeches, presentation of technical papers, and panel discussions. To emphasize the unique international nature of the summit, panel discussants and moderators have been selected from different countries and backgrounds to reflect a balanced representation from government, industry, civil society, and the international community. Thank you so much for your attention, and thanks once again to ASEP for the privilege of chairing this session. Enjoy your summit. Thank you.
You can do it better with a bigger round of applause, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Juliet Chumisi-Anoche. So the next individual I'm about to introduce really illustrates how far this summit has traveled. Even before I do that, I need to acknowledge and say a big thank you to Oxfam, also to NORAD, the Ford Foundation, the Natural Resource Governance Institute, also to the University of Dundee and the Open University. They have made this possible. They helping us put this together with the endorsement of the Ministry of Energy. And if you are here and you would want to, I guess, join in the conversations and probably listen to it in another language, you find around your roundtables your listening devices. You can use them at will. And we have a booth set up there that will help with interpretation as well. I was saying that the next individual I'm about to introduce illustrates how far this summit has traveled over the last 4 years, because when we first started 4 years ago, he was the deputy at the Africa Center for Energy Policy. 4 years on, he is the executive director at that same center, and they have been at the forefront of putting this together. Ladies and gentlemen, please, with a round of applause, help me welcome Mr. Benjamin Boakye.
Thank you very much, Evans. And after such impressive delivery from our chairperson, I guess I can just say welcome and sit down. Madam Chair, Honorable Minister of Energy, Ghana, Mr. John Peter Amewu, Honorable Deputy Minister of Energy, Ghana, Alhaji Dr. Mohammed Amin Adam, Honorable former Minister of Sudan, Dr. Osman, representatives of Parliament, representatives of the diplomatic community, thank you very much and welcome to the 2018 Africa Oil Governance Summit. Let me also welcome everybody who has traveled far and near to be here to join us for this year's summit. This annual event provides a unique platform for stakeholders in Africa, Africa's petroleum industry, and related sectors to share best practices on optimizing the benefits of Africa's oil and gas resources. What we have been trying to do with this gathering since 2015 is to create a forum that is not discriminatory of any class of society on the governance of the oil and gas industry. By that I mean the summit is not a gathering between civil society and government alone, or business and government, which is the dominant engagement you would find every time oil and gas is mentioned. Neither is it a social mobilization against government and the investor community. Rather, we are promoting a broad engagement among government, investors, academia, think tanks, civil society, affected communities, traditional leaders, people with disability, and individuals who are interested in ensuring that the extraction of oil and gas translates to socio-economic development of our people. The focus of last year's summit was anchored on open contracting and how African countries can recognize it as a key for improved transparency, accountability, fairness towards all investors, as well as important for determination of optimal national take. The summit yielded consensus on the need for transparency in the award of contracts across the value chain, including the utilization of revenues generated from the industry by government. We also got key commitments from Ghana and Nigeria. The government of Ghana pledged to implement the open contracting provisions in the Petroleum Exploration and Production Act. We are happy to report that subsequently, the government has passed the Petroleum Exploration and Production General Regulations 2018 to allow for commencement of open licensing of petroleum blocks with requirement for beneficial ownership disclosure. The first promotional activity was undertaken in South Africa last week at the Africa Oil Week. Nigeria also promised to undertake competitive licensing round for its marginal oil fields. We have been monitoring Nigeria on the progress on its commitments. We acknowledge that though the licensing round is still pending, it remains on the agenda of the Nigerian government. Across the region also, there is a renewed effort to institutionalize transparent contracting principles in the oil and gas industry. Early this month, the presidents of Senegal and Sierra Leone committed to implementing beneficial ownership disclosures in the award of petroleum blocks by 2020 as required by the EITI. We will continue to encourage other countries to follow this trend. Madam Chair, this year, the summit focuses on local content under the theme, harnessing the potential of local content for economic growth and inclusive development. We note that the subject of local content is very important for resource-rich countries. The evolution of local content laws and policies across the region is a testament to a certain consensus that resource-rich countries want more benefits from their natural resource wealth beyond the fiscal take. The expected benefits from local content requirements include job creation, value addition through industrial development, and economic growth through forward, sidewards, and backward linkages of the extractive sector to the rest of the nation's economy. In spite of the prospects of local content, the right approach and effective mode of implementation is not a settled conversation. There are those who believe that local content prescriptions could be a disincentive for investment. Others also believe that achieving effective local content is a shared responsibility among governments, investors, industry, and academia. However, the implementation often tilts the scale of responsibility towards the government and/or investor, depending on the governance regime. Resolving these contestations is one of the reasons why we are discussing local content at this year's summit. Fortunately, we have government representatives in the room. We have investors here. The academics are also here. We have representatives of industry. We have civil society. And we have other important constituencies amongst us. It is my hope that the two-day Africa Oil Governance Summit will provide us with the needed convergence on the effective approach to delivering local content and sustain investment concurrently in a way that achieve Pareto outcomes. Madam Chair, whilst deliberating on the effective way of implementing local content, let us spend a bit more time to reflect on creating opportunities for women and people with disability who can still play some role in the industry. Traditionally, the oil industry has been dominated by men. Recent statistics show some improvements, though. Women participation has grown to about 22%, according to Boston Consulting Group. But there is still more room for improvement. The oil industry ranks just behind construction industry at the bottom of league of industry with fewer women. Job satisfaction for women in the industry is also said to be low. While job satisfaction in men grows with every year they stay in the industry, that of women fall to the lowest within 3 to 5 years due to lack of awareness of opportunities for growth. This is not encouraging. We should also ponder on what opportunities we can create for persons with disability. They must not be left out. This year, ASAP has empowered the visually impaired to follow and understand resource revenue governance issues in Ghana by transcribing the Ghana EITI report into Braille. We intend to do more. We intend to do more to enable persons with disability have access to industry information and participate in making of decisions that affects them. Enabling persons with disability put their best forward should be a norm. In the short term, this may require conscious and concerted effort on the part of government, business community, and civil society to provide them with positive incentive and the right environment to participate. I will end by acknowledging the massive support provided by our partners who have remained committed to this cause to make this summit possible. To Oxfam, Ford Foundation, the Natural Resource Governance Institute, Open University UK, Dundee University, NORAD, we say a big thank you. I would also like to thank you, Honorable Minister of Energy and the Ministry, for your consistent support and endorsement of this summit for the past 4 years. I thank everyone here for making it to the summit, particularly those who have traveled from across the region and beyond to be here. I know sometimes it can be extremely difficult to travel from Chad, Zimbabwe, Senegal, and it could even be longer than coming from North America because of our transportation systems. And that could be a conversation for another day. On that note, Akwaba, and I wish you a fruitful deliberation.
Ladies and gentlemen, Benjamin Boakye. A round of applause again for him. He is the Executive Director of the Africa Center for Energy Policy. There's a man here with the power to shut us down literally. He is the man when he talks about the oil and gas sector. Oil and gas sector is a powerful industry already, but in every jurisdiction you go, you need one person who sits at the top who helps steer affairs of that particular sector. And thankfully, when you come to Ghana, ASAP has managed to drag this gentleman into our midst. And ladies and gentlemen, if you would be kind enough to help me with a standing ovation, welcome the Minister for Energy for the Republic of Ghana, John Peter Mewu, who will deliver our keynote address for us today. A big round of applause for him, the Energy Minister.
Thank you, Evans. First of all, let me say a very big thanks to ASAP, having listened to your speech, for making the oil and gas sector a very good playing field for the disabled. I think this very interesting, and we would have to encourage ASAP in doing that. Again, I also want to thank you for commending the government of the Republic of Ghana for taking the bold steps and making sure that we have been able to undertake open and competitive bidding processes. Madam Chairperson, the Executive Director of African Center for Energy Policy, the Deputy Minister of Energy, Dr. Mohamed Amin, government representatives across Africa, captains of the oil and gas companies here present, the media, the press, distinguished guests, I deem it a great honor and pleasure to be present at this summit to deliver a keynote address on the theme harnessing the potentials of local content for economic growth and inclusive development. First of all, I would like to commend the organizers of this summit and express my heartfelt gratitude for the opportunity offered me to be part of this August event. I consider this event very important because it offers a perfect platform to discuss common challenges that confront countries in their attempt to implement local content policies, legislations, regulations for the benefits of international generational equity. Madam Chairperson, after the commercial discovery of oil and gas in 2007 in Ghana, we might have all witnessed the joy in the faces of Ghanaians with a lot of anxiety and hope that their sufferings have come to an end. You might have witnessed taxi drivers on the streets, pito sellers, palm wine sellers, all begin to think that there's a future Ghana awaiting as a result of the discovery of oil and gas. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, Ghana at that stage begins to develop rules and regulations that will make it mandatory for every Ghanaian to begin to benefit from these resources. The question we need to ask ourselves and reasons that we gathered here today is whether that 2007 discovery, the hope of the taxi driver, the aspirations of the plumber, the agitations and the sufferings of Ghanaians before the oil discovery have actually been met. It is therefore interesting that conference of this nature, in an attempt to address issues that will make the playing field more beneficial to Ghanaians, must take into considerations past and future performances and actions of other African countries. Distinguished guests, at the commencement of the LI 2204 implementations, you will recollect that less than 100 Ghanaian firms were registered and operating at the country at that time. As of September 2018, there were over 600 indigenous Ghanaian companies registered and providing goods and services to the industry here in Ghana. For example, the Sankofa Ginyami field in Ghana, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, has awarded over 320 contracts worth 1.8 billion to indigenous Ghanaian companies and about 56% of workers on the FPSO in Ghana. The ENI or the OCTP projects has also awarded about 6.2 billion US dollars, out of which 1.75 billion representing 28% of contracts awarded to Ghanaian companies within the period. In terms of localizations of employment, we have witnessed over the period between 75 to 78% of workers in the middle and junior level managerial roles who, in their attempt to get higher roles, have been considered in award positions. Was John the plumber part of this category? Madam Chairperson, in spite of the success chalked, it is imperative going forward that we highlight the implementation challenges that we face as a country. And it's also important that we begin to take notice that the era of cheap oil is gone. And as IOCs begins to migrate into challenging waters, implementation challenges of local content would also be visible for everybody to see. In challenging waters, there is a need for improved technology. There is a need for improved skills, higher levels of understanding of behavior of the reservoir, and all the other items and facilities that are necessary to lift the oil. On this basis, challenges are therefore opened and become visible in our attempt to implement local content policies. First and foremost, in spite of the increased local participation in the sector, The local companies are faced with numerous challenges ranging from lack of finance, human and capital development, technology, among others. This goes a long way to adversely affect their competitiveness in the industry. These barriers to local participation have resulted in over-concentrations of local companies in the low-hanging fruits and less participations in high-value capital and technological-intensive services. Madam Chairperson, another challenge, ladies and gentlemen, is the inability of the indigenous companies to meet international standards coupled with inadequate certifications. These challenges are due to the following. 1. Higher costs of certifying employees and companies. And 2. Small and poorly structured nature of most companies, thus failing to meet competency requirements. The limited capacity of local companies to deliver services required due to the absence of infrastructure to support the development of the petroleum industry, limits the volume of work to be carried out in country. The international oil companies would always prefer to work with experienced international service providers since they've worked with them previously. It is therefore important, ladies and gentlemen, to be cognizant of the role of important information asymmetry on tendering processes. Indigenous companies receive information on tendering very late, as against early notifications by international service providers. This state of affairs clearly does not create a level playing field for indigenous companies. It is noteworthy that there are a number of small, poorly structured indigenous companies with limited capacity to execute contracts stemming from the following. Number 1, limited investment in facilities, infrastructure, and personnel, resulting in inability to undertake multiple projects. No specializations in their areas that they claim to be specialized in. Fragmented nature of small companies, resulting in no or little economics of scale. And finally, the possibility of indigenous Ghanaian companies winning contracts while competing with international experienced companies remain a very difficult task. Madam Chairperson, the issue of insufficient financial opportunities for local companies largely attributed to the fact that the financial institutions in Ghana perceive the oil and gas industry as highly risky industry and are therefore not ready to offer loans coupled with high interest rate by banks makes it very difficult for loan acquisitions by indigenous companies to undertake ventures in the oil and gas industry. Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the issue of prohibitive costs of fabrications in host countries as against fabrications overseas is another major challenge facing emerging oil and gas countries such as ours. The absence of manufacturing units for basic inputs leaves the indigenous companies with no options than to import raw materials, which increase their cost of production and eventually makes them very uncompetitive. There is also a limited participation of Ghanaian companies in joint venture activities, largely due to the following. Number 1, there is an extensive foreign companies restructuring their joint venture shareholding structure in an attempt to become indigenous companies. This is currently going in most of African countries. And there's also an overlooking line of business level of participations of indigenous Ghanaian companies. Misalignment of roles and responsibilities, that's making it difficult for technology transfer, and also inabilities of those technologies, even if they are transferred, to be the actual technologies to be transferred. Madam Chairperson, the final and the most important issue that we faced is the issue of the oligopolistic markets, where few indigenous companies obtain contracts, data that shows that there has been some level of concentrations of those indigenous companies in certain services pursuing limited business opportunities in the industry. Madam Chairperson, as I take my seat, I would really like to charge the stakeholders gathered here today that the reasons that has brought us here today, our understanding of the local agenda, our understanding of our national participation should just not be another talk show. I know and I have the belief and trust in the organizers of this forum, the Africa Center for Energy Policy, that this particular conference and forum will really give a value for the participants. I expect that all discussions, concerns, and pieces of advice that will emanate from this summit will be put into actions. I thank you all, and may God bless our homeland, Ghana. Thank you.
So yes, I'm detaining the minister. I'm just hoping that his. Did you bring your security guard? No. Okay. So I'm just checking because I'm detaining you. I'm just detaining you for a few minutes. I want to invite Ben Boakye and Adelaide with Gogig to join me here and please share in the crime of detaining the minister against his will for a few more minutes. Thankfully you didn't bring your police guard. If he's here, he should stand outside and wait. And so yes, also there is, something that the ministry has done over the years, in fact from last year to this year, as we've been organizing this summit, they have been consistent in taking our recommendations. And so we have a tiny little presentation to make in acknowledgement of that. Ben?
Ladies and gentlemen, the citation reads, Commendation. ASAP commends the government of Ghana for making Ghana the first in ECOWAS and second in the region to require beneficial ownership disclosure as fundamental to the grant of petroleum rights. Posterity will be grateful for government's commitment to transparency in Ghana's petroleum sector through the passage of the Petroleum Exploration and Production General Regulations 2018, AECO.
And this is also to say that all governments that follow through their commitments will be acknowledged on this platform. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister. A big round of applause for him and ASAP for acknowledging his great work at the ministry. And I hereby release you in peace. So it's time to get into, I guess, some of the details why we're here at today's summit. We're going to have a brief presentation on the topic, beyond legislation, what should be the role of government, after which I'll hand over to the chairperson to facilitate the conversations around that topic. And so, ladies and gentlemen, help me welcome Dr. Richmond Atta Ankuma and Professor Giles Mohan. You want to refer to the brochure that you were giving. The details are there. You can read about them as they make this joint presentation. A round of applause to them as they come forward. Beyond legislation, what should be the role of government?
Thank you very much, and I'd like to formally thank ASAP again for this wonderful event. As you'll see, we've been working with them for a few years now on a research project, and they've been a wonderful partner, and Ben and the team have really helped us to get some very good data, and then are able to organize events like this where we can talk about some of those results. We're not going to kind of bore you with lots of academic stuff today. We just wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the themes that have emerged from our own research. And that research was funded by DFID in the UK to look at the implications of, largely to look at new actors in Africa's oil and gas, and particularly the Chinese. We heard from Dr. Chumesi this morning about what the Chinese might or might not be doing, and that was one of the main focuses that we had. As these new actors come into Africa's oil and gas, how do they compare with established IOCs, especially working in new oil markets, but also what are the implications of that for those kind of issues that Ben was talking about around inclusive development. So we had a big international team. We've heard the University of Dundee and the Open University in the UK. We had University of Khartoum. We had University of Ghana. We had colleagues in Nigeria and colleagues in China helping us to do this research. And there was a number of themes which I'm not going to go into any detail, but one of the most important themes I think for today was around how do you leverage this new forms of investment into Africa's oil and gas sector for inclusive growth, and how do you develop linkages and localize that for development. And we worked in 3 countries, Sudan, Nigeria, Ghana, and to some extent a little bit in Uganda as well. And the kind of the drive for local content, as we've heard, comes from a whole set of kind of known problems. One obviously is around the resource curse, but the notion of the enclave economy, that how do you break out of that enclave to bring those developments. Also the role of transnational actors in the gas sector, oil and gas sector, where there tends to be extroversion of some of that value. And certainly China, I think, raises some interesting issues. You know, that they're accused, and I think these are accusations of, you know, integrating supply chains, bringing labor, of other things which are running against the benefits of local economies in Africa. And I think some of that is media speculation and hype. But certainly I think it's interesting to see how far China does disrupt some of those established patterns. And we see from other countries, Canada, Norway, Australia, the possibilities that industrial linkages can be built from commodities sector if you get certain institutional things right. I guess one of the warnings, though, that informs our work is from the publication from the World Bank by Tordo et al. That there's no standard package of local content policies, and certainly that, I think that's been borne out in our own research. What we've tried to do by comparing across different countries and looking at different investors in those oil and gas sectors is to look at the difference that different actors make to the ways in which local content may or may not be facilitated. And I think one of the interesting things, certainly, that the Chinese bring to that mix is this question of infrastructure, that if you have oil for infrastructure deals, you know, to what extent does that infrastructure that is built on the back of oil sales also benefiting to inclusive development? So it's not just focusing on the direct employment that might come from the investment, but what might be the wider ramifications of that. And that's, as researchers, that's quite hard to do, because you're then looking at a much wider set of linkages. But certainly I think the time is right. I think, you know, we've seen a move much more from compliance around LCPs to one which is about good business practice and good business logic. We were in Beijing a couple of weeks ago doing some dissemination and met people there from the big Chinese national oil companies, CNPC, Sinopec and others, kept saying, well, you know, for us local content makes business sense. It's not about a moral obligation. It's that you can do things more cheaply and more effectively if you localize effectively. So I think the time now is right to have this wonderful event today. I'm going to hand over to my colleague from the University of Ghana, who's going to talk a little bit about some of very quickly the findings from that before we hand over to the main speakers. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Just thank you for the introduction. So I will go into a bit of the details concerning some of the things that we were able to find regarding local content during our research. So I'll start by just doing a quick overview of some of the local content details when it comes to targets that we set for ourselves as a country in order to ensure enough value addition is being created within, enough employment are being created for locals. So this is for Ghana. So as many of you may know, I mean, we've got these targets in terms of goods and services. Our expectation is that by the 10th year of exploration and production, we should be able to achieve something in the region of 60 to 90%, 70 to 80% in the case of employment at the management level, and then around the same for technical core staff. In terms of equity participation in Ghana, the minister mentioned there's this 5% equity participation expected of indigenous companies in all petroleum agreements. And then there's also a 10% equity participation in joint venture for any subcontracting activities associated with the petroleum industry. So let me go into issues about, because we tried to do the research in broader 3 countries, but today I'm going to focus a little bit on Ghana and Sudan. So let me try and give some contextual differences which speak to the extent to which localization or local content implementation has been achieved. And again, so moving from where I ended earlier about Ghana having some targets. In Ghana, the local content regime has got some strict targets, which you don't really find in Sudan. So in Sudan, what happens is that local content is really enshrined in the various exploration and production sharing agreements, rather than having a specific law, an overall law that deals with local content issues. And the other areas where we find a bit of distinction between these two contents has to do with the manner in which local content is being implemented. In Ghana, you find this sort of arm's length relationship between the government, the regulator, and the private sector in terms of implementation of local content. So the government says, oh, the law is there. Indigenous companies can have 5% equity holdings. So it's up to you, large extent, to find out how you can take advantage of that. So that is the sense that we got from the research that we did, interviewing a lot of indigenous suppliers here in Ghana. But in Sudan, you have this sort of interlogging relationship between Sudapet, which is the national oil company, and the lead operator, CNPC, a Chinese national oil company. And more or less, local content is being mainly pushed through Sudapet's engagement or relationship with the lead operators. And you see a big difference there. So largely, we realize that in Sudan, equity participation is largely in the hands of Sudapet and its subsidiaries. Whereas in Ghana, we're talking about joint venture, particularly with regards to subcontracting, you see some Ghanaian participation in there. That's not to say that in Sudan there isn't anything happen, but the extent to which the indigenous companies are benefiting is a bit limited. It's dwarfed by the participation of Sudapet in the various supply chains. And then we also see some distinction between the nature or the character of the NOCs in these different contexts. In Ghana, the National Oil Company is not so much integrated into the administrative procedures of the ministry. You have a regulator totally separated from the National Oil Company. But in Sudan, it's totally different. The Sudapet is part and parcel of the Ministry of Petroleum, and it's also the regulator within the industry. So when you're talking about the impacts or how have we been able to implement local content and the achievement, timing is also key. So one of the things that we should be very careful about when you compare these two contexts. Ghana has been in the business for around 10 years, whilst in Sudan, the industry has been there for nearly 2 decades or more. And then another difference is the kind of foreign participation in the industry in these two contexts. In Ghana, you have mainly IOCs, and the lead operator here is Tullow, which is relatively a small IOC, compared to Sudan, where you've got national oil companies, mainly from Asia. We're talking about CNPC and oil companies from national oil companies from India and Malaysia being the main operators. And here, the fact that I'm raising this speaks to the earlier point by Charles that you've got national oil companies from China, and they come with some distinctive characteristics in terms of the extent of localization they want to achieve, and compared to a national oil company. And then the other thing that is also critical is the location and geology of the oil resource itself. In Ghana, mainly is offshore, and offshore activities mainly requires high-level capacity in terms of developing. And so, I mean, doing local content in Ghana could be totally different. You might need more capacity. If you're talking about simple welding under the sea could be more challenging than doing it onshore. So in Sudan, it's mainly onshore. And so the technical capacity requirement might be a bit lower. And then a major key difference in this context has to do with the political context. So, is the political context. So Ghana has been described as having a competitive clientelist sort of political system, but in Sudan, it's merely a dominant party kind of system where you've had one president for a very long time. So essentially, over the period of oil exploitation in Sudan, there has been only one president. While Ghana, we've had a lot of changes, and that has implications with a lot of the way things are done. A typical example is how GNPC has been managed over two regimes, political regimes in Ghana here. In NPP time, its role was a bit minimized, and then NDC came, and then it was somehow uplifted again. And then there's also a difference with regards to the role of civil society organizations. In Ghana, we've got a lot of civil society organizations, except sometimes says it's a civil society organization. And yes, it does. And so putting pressure on government with regards to policy and policy implementation in all areas. In Sudan, it's not like that. It's quite weak. And that also brings a difference in context, because if you have a very weak civil society organization, then you can do a lot of things and get away with it. The other side is that civil societies can also drag the process of building consensus around policy making and implementation. So these sort of differences might have implications on the achievement when it comes to local content and localization in Ghana. In terms of what we see, gathered where we are at the level of localization, what we see is, in terms of employment, there isn't much difference between Sudan and Ghana. Sudan talks about 90% localization. We don't have very equivalent figures here, but we know that Tullow says that it's achieved about 73% localization. As to whether it is 73% at all levels is a bit of a question that we don't know. The other thing is that in both settings, you've got equity participation mainly being in the hands of the NOC, the National Oil Company. So in Sudan, it's Sudapet, which has got about 5% participation in all oil blocks. In Ghana, it is GNPC with about 10 to 15%. It used to be 10%, now they've pushed it to 50% with the new EMP law. Yeah, so I made this point earlier that so private participation in Ghana is, especially in petroleum agreement, is still limited. You have 5% for indigenous companies, but as the minister said, the indigenous companies, for various reasons, are not able to take advantage of that 5%. In Sudan, they don't have any specific target, as I mentioned earlier, and participation is mainly through the national oil company and its subsidiaries. Okay. Now, let me just mention a few areas where we consider them to be similar. We consider these two different countries to be similar, given the differences in the context. One, we could also see this as mainly as some of the challenges affecting the implementation of local content. And one is limited access to capital. And the minister rightly mentioned it, that in Ghana, for example, the capital markets are not really working very well. So it's difficult to access specialized and long-term capital for investment in the industry. And that has implication for achieving the equity participation rate for indigenous companies. And that has led to the issue of fronting. He mentioned it. And when you speak to a lot of stakeholders within the industry, they will also mention the same situation. The perception that there's high fronting taking place in the Ghanaian sector is really an issue. Similar arguments can be made for the Sudanese context. And then one area where you see a bit of similarity has to do with the definition of what we want to achieve with local content. In both contexts, they see local content to mean employment generation, equity participation, and supply of goods and services, as well as skill development or capacity development in general. But as just mentioned, there are areas where you could also look at, but it's not really recognized in these two contexts as critical to local content development. And these are areas like a lead firm or companies within the supply chain investing in infrastructure and other activities that do not directly lead to production or feed into their production activities. They are not inputting their production activities. For example, if Tello builds a hospital or builds a feeder road or provides water somewhere in a rural community around where the oil installations are. So these are some of the things that we see as similar. So in both contexts, the emphasis is not on that. And then there is also an issue about capacity. So it appears capacity is low, and I think the minister also mentioned it. So when the minister was delivering his speech, I was telling my colleagues that it seems a lot of the things that we wanted to say, he's already mentioned them. So capacity is low. But then the other issue or twist around it is there's this perception. The indigenous companies say that there's this perception that they've got low capacity, but indeed they don't think that their capacity is that low. And for them, the lead firms are just making up stories to avoid granting them contracts under the pretext of low capacity levels within them. So we put a big question mark there. So these are areas that we would expect more debate. And then maybe further research into. And then there are issues about the targets being overambitious. So some people think that target could be overambitious. For example, the 5% equity participation. If we know very well that our financial markets are not really performing well, why do we set ourselves 5% equity participation and expect to achieve them within the shortest possible time? So these are questions. And some people say, well, it also raises issues about whether there was some level of arbitrariness in the way the targets were determined. So these are some of the issues that we think would need to have further discussions on. And then there is also issue about, in a dynamic sense, how do we find some resonance between the targets that are set and the capacity development plans and implementation. So if you want 90% localization, what are you doing now to ensure that 10 years from now you'll be able to achieve that? And then the other issue that came up during our conversations with the suppliers is around ownership syndrome. I mean, there's this idea that because financial resources are difficult to raise in this context, why not pool resources together as indigenous companies so that you could present one company with more resources or financial capital, financial muscle? But then there are issues about the culture of business in these contexts. So people want to go alone. I don't know whether there are issues of trusts among Ghanaians, but then they want to go solo so that they can maybe reap all the benefits for themselves. So this is where we need to have further debate and discussion as to how we can encourage these indigenous companies to do business together and present a common fund with a bigger muscle to get more contracts. Okay, so I would end here and call on Giles to sort of provide an overall
Thank you, Richmond. I'm not going to detain you any longer, really. Suffice to say, I didn't hack the Minister's presentation, but we concur with many of his conclusions around the need for financing is a key issue in this, but maybe beyond the oil and gas sector to rectify. So I think there's an issue about how you join up various areas of government policy. Totally agree with the question about low-hanging fruit is, there's a tendency to overly focus on oil fields and technical interventions as opposed to thinking more broadly about how local content can be developed. And clearly trying to work out what the political context means in terms of how far you can develop some of these policies and implement them. I think, and we see in Ghana and Sudan two very different contexts, and very different ways in which local content policy is being implemented, and with differing levels of success. But actually, I think we need to understand that those local contexts, understand what is possible. So I'm very much looking forward to the next day and a half, really, of finding out some answers to some of the questions we've posed ourselves as well in our research. So thank you very much.
These are definitely muted applause. I wanted a louder one for them with that presentation. We're going to have a conversation around what we've heard. Beyond legislation, what should be the role of government? Thank you. And our chairperson will facilitate this session, Dr. Julia Twumasi-Anokye, and she will be joined by a host of guests. And so I'm going to leave Dr. Julia Twumasi-Anokye to do the introduction of your guests. Good. So yes. So ladies and gentlemen, I'm handing over now to Dr. Julia Twumasi-Anokye.
Thank you so much, Evans. I think I'll use the podium for the invitation, and then afterwards we can sit down and have a nice conversation. Thank you. As we have been told, the topic for this discussion is local content beyond legislation. What should be the role of government in local content implementation? Before I invite my panel, I just wanted to make an observation on the previous presentation and the Honorable Minister's speech. And as I sat there listening, I thought that if I shut my eyes, I could be in Nigeria, I could be in Congo, I could be in Angola, I could be in Senegal, I could be in Gambia. And that's because the issues of local content cut across the whole Africa. You could go into any of these countries and still hear the same issues that we are debating here in Ghana, also being debated in those countries. So it just tells us that we are all on the right path, we have the same problem, and we need to strategize to come up with solutions. So fortunately, I am hoping that my panel here, a very esteemed panel, I may add, will shed some light on what do we do beyond legislation. Because if you look across Africa, most countries that have an extractive industry have one law or the other on local content, either in the mining sector or in the oil and gas sector. So we seem to have a plethora of laws and policies and instruments, and you name it, we've got it. Where do we go from here? Do the laws implement themselves? Is there a role for government? What can government do, and what can industry do? So I take this privilege to invite my panel up. And the first person that I will invite, as they say, ladies first. So I shall invite Madame Neema Lugangira. Can we give her a round of applause as she comes up stage? Madame Neema has come all the way from Tanzania, and she's the head of policy at SACCOT, which is the Southern Agricultural Growth Corridor of Tanzania. This role strategically positions her to continue with, continue with her passion of being a change agent through contributing to sustainable development in the SACCOT initiative and to the agricultural sector of Tanzania, including multi-sectoral linkages and beyond. She is also championing gender and nutrition agenda through ensuring SACCOT private sectors partners through SACCOT's private sector partners investments, resulting into gender inclusivity and nutrition security. In addition to her contribution to several global initiatives within the local content sphere, Neema was a member of the Global Steering Committee tasked with developing global reporting standards for local content, local procurement in the extractive sector. And she's also the author of the book, Local Content in Supply Development, April 2014. Ladies and gentlemen, Madame Neema Lugangira. My next guest, I am not sure if he's here yet. He's coming all the way from Kenya. So can I see if Honorable John Manye is in the room? I understand he flew in this morning, so unfortunately he's not here yet. So we will skip and then move on very quickly. My next esteemed guest who is coming up is also come all the way from Sudan. We have Honorable Dr. Abdul Rahman. Doc, if you can please join me on stage. Dr. Rahman is a first-class undergraduate of mechanical engineering from the University of Khartoum, Sudan. He obtained his PhD in December 1973, and it was conferred in July 1974 from the University of Birmingham, UK. Can someone please share the joke? Okay, since January 1998, Dr. Abdul Rahman is back to work at the Ben Barhia as its general manager. That's a consultancy firm, and he tells me, he told me a very lovely story this morning about Barhia and King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. I'll leave him to tell you himself at some point. He has remained a freelance consultant and a member of the advisory board for the Minister of Petroleum and a consultant for their engineering projects until 2008. He was a member of the board of directors of SUDAPET, so for purposes of our research, you may want to have a quiet word with him in the margins of the summit, up to October 2010. And he is also a member of the board of directors of Asawa, a SUDAPET company for oil construction. Dr. Rahman specializes in the development and negotiation of agreements, and he was appointed as the Minister of Petroleum and Gas in the Republic of Sudan on the 12th of May 2017, and he was released this year on the 13th of May 2018 back to his beloved consultancy, Ben Barhia. Can we give him another round of applause? My final guest is Honorable Dr. Muhammad Amin Adam. Can we give him a round of applause? Who is the Honorable Deputy Minister of Energy in Ghana with responsibility for the petroleum sector. Before then, he was a founder and executive director of the Africa Center for Energy Policy, ACEP. And it's great that we have Dr. Amin here. When I used to be in the Petroleum Commission and he was in ACEP, we used to get into a lot of tussles and a lot of debates. So it'd be very interesting to see his views now that he's on the government side and I'm a private citizen. So now I can ask him whatever I want without being politically correct. So I'm happy to have you here, Dr. Amin. He's, as I said, he's a deputy minister. Before then, he was a founder of ACEP. And then he previously worked in other public and private organizations as an energy policy analyst at the Ministry of Energy in Ghana, the Commission of Ghana's Public Utilities Regulatory Commission, PURC we call it. And he was a former Deputy Minister of State for the Northern Region and a former mayor of Ghana's third city, which is Tamale. He was also the Africa Coordinator of Extractive Industries in IBIS. He's an international man. In Africa, he has worked on petroleum policy and resource governance projects in Liberia, Sierra Leone, Uganda, Tanzania, South Sudan, and Kenya, advising governments and supporting parliamentary committees and CSOs. Dr. Adam recently testified on how Africa can avoid the resource curse before the United States Congress House Subcommittee on Africa, Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations. So ladies and gentlemen, can we have another round of applause for my august panel as we go into this discussion? So what I intend to do, per my instructions, and Ben and his guys have me on a very tight leash, so I have a program so I don't start ranting about local content, which I sometimes do. And I have 45 minutes. Thank you very much, Evans. So we will start, I'll take my seat, and then I'll start with Nima, if you can just 5 minutes or so on the topic as to what you want to say, and then we'll come back into the discussions, and then hopefully I can get the chance to put the very difficult questions to you. Thank you. So Nima.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. It's with great pleasure to be here with you all this morning, especially being in such a big panel. I was joking with Freda that I hope I'm going to do justice to being part of this panelist, so wish me luck. As already introduced, my name is Neema Lugangira. I'm from Tanzania, and I have the unique opportunity of starting up the local content agenda in Tanzania, where I worked at Statoil, which is one of the international oil companies who are going to be investing in the LNG project in Tanzania. And whilst there, I came to see the great importance for Tanzania to have a local content policy. And therefore, I started advocating a lot to our government through the Ministry of Energy and Minerals that we needed to have a local content policy. And finally, the opportunity came up, and I quit my Statoil job, which was very high paying, to go and volunteer and help the government have this local content policy. And later, got the opportunity to start up the local content department under the Prime Minister's office. And after having done that and championing and advocating for local content for about 4 or 5 years, it had got to a point where if someone sees NEMA, they see local content. And I thought, no, this is not very sustainable. But in the process, it also became apparent that linkage between the oil and gas sector and other sectors is very important. And that's why I'm now in the agricultural sector, which is totally different from extractive, but it was a strategic decision to do so. It was a strategic decision because when we are championing local content, we want to increase the participation of locals. So in case of Tanzania, it was to increase the participation of Tanzanians. But as we all know, the extractive sector is very highly skilled. So it's not very easy to get a lot of job opportunities for local people. Same as with the supply of goods and services. But all of these people need to eat. So the agriculture sector becomes a crucial sector for multi-sectoral linkages. Because if we take the mining sector, for example, there are probably about 5,000 people working, and they need to be fed every day. That's 4 meals a day. That's 20,000 plates every day. That's money. But because our agricultural sector is not established enough to meet the standards or get the opportunities from the extractive sector, what happens is catering opportunities are being given to international catering companies, and as a result, most of the agricultural produce is being imported from outside the country. And right there is a huge revenue loss. So much as governments are focusing on the more technical side or the opportunities that are directly linked to the oil and gas sector, it's very important and actually crucial to start looking at these forward and backward linkages with other sectors like the agricultural sector. So this meeting today is very important, and particularly because we're talking about beyond legislation. Just like other African countries, Tanzania, we have an oil and gas policy. We have the Petroleum Act of 2015, which has specific local content requirements. We have local content regulations, and a lot of learning was taken from different African countries, including Ghana. But once you have all of that in place, then what? You know, it can be a very good document, but it might very well just remain to be on paper, and it's not implementable. So when we come to implement, that's when you come and see, actually, we shouldn't just focus on the oil and gas sector. There is importance to link it with the construction sector. There is importance to link with the environmental sectors. So it becomes a much wider scale. But then the challenge comes, we have a local content regulation and the whole policy framework for the oil and gas and mining sector. But we don't have the same, for example, for the agricultural sector. So then even though you're pushing for local content, it's legal in one sector, it's a legal requirement, but then it's not in the other sector, then the efforts become somewhat detrimental because the different policies and regulations we have in our countries don't speak to each other. So I think one of the things that governments can do beyond legislation is to see how can we harmonize and align the different requirements for the different sectors. Because when we're talking about we want to improve local businesses to participate in this sector, how can you do so when, I'll just give an example for Tanzania. We have if you want to deal in the, let's say, food value chains, you'll have at least 5 main government regulators. And these 5 main government regulators sit under 3 different ministries. And the 4th one is the energy or the mining ministry. So how can I, as a small business, let's say I'm producing food, I want to become a supplier to the oil and gas sector, but on one side, I have to adhere to the requirements of Ministry of Health, there's Ministry of Industry and Trade, Ministry of Agriculture, Ministry of Oil and Gas, or Ministry of Mining, and you find the laws in between, they are not all promoting or accommodating that local participation. So then it becomes very challenging. So one of the things that I would probably highly recommend is that there needs to be harmonization on this post legislation, and that is a role that the government can critically play. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Neema Lugangira. Neema has taken us on a journey on various linkages to the oil and gas sector and the extractive sector. I'm very happy that she's brought a perspective from the agricultural sector, which is an area that in Africa we don't tend to pay too much attention to when there are oil and gas resources, leading to resource scarce issues and all the rest of it. So I'm very happy that she's brought that perspective. So once again, thank you very much. I'm going to move on very strictly to Dr. Rahman. And Dr. Rahman, I have a special question for you. As well as I'll come to the Honorable Deputy Minister as well. And that is because both of you have been in government, both of you have been, well, Dr. Amin is still in government, but you were in government in the Sudan. And I believe that the experiences, the synergies between what may have happened in the Sudan and what happens in Ghana. This morning you told me about the Queen of Sheba, so I will also use a Shakespearean example. You know, there was a speech between Brutus and Cassius in Julius Caesar when they were planning the murder of Caesar, and Brutus tells Cassius that there is a tide in the affairs of men, which taking out the flood leads on to good fortune. Africa is at that point. We are at the point where we are floating on that sea, and that sea is all the local content legislation that we put together, all the conferences that we have, such as today, all the meetings we've had with the oil and gas company. So on that sea that we are now adrift, if we take it at the current, it will definitely lead to our good fortune. And I want to know from you, unfortunately Caesar and Brutus were planning a diabolical enterprise, but we are not planning a diabolical enterprise. For us, this is local content. So I want you to tell us your perspective. After the laws, where can government go? If you were to advise the government of Sudan today and to speak to them, what would you be telling them that after the laws, where do we go from here? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I start, I would like to mention that part of my resume was missed, which I regard as important to this forum. I was a director of the General Petroleum Corporation when I was working for ADNOC in Abu Dhabi, called by the government to head that organization. Part of our portfolio was to have a model agreement for the exploration and production sharing agreements in the Sudan. And that was very important for us because during or before that, all agreements were signed which were brought in by the companies, exploration companies, and the government just signed with all that the regulatory mistakes are in them. And for that reason, we were very careful in drafting some of the articles, including the article for the training and employment of the nationals, and also for the contracting and service provision in those exploration and production sharing agreements. And in that agreement or model agreement, it was important that as acknowledged by the contractor and the government, that the people employed shall be skilled people. And the other thing is that no expatriate will be employed before the contract of service, the CV of that person, and the duration of the contract were presented to the minister for approval. And the minister is to see, isn't there any person in the country who is national to occupy that position before he approves the employment of that person, the expat, and also within a certain duration, a shadow person from the nationals has to be put with him in order to take over from him within a couple of years. This was enshrined in the agreements. And as you know, that agreements are also passed by the parliament, and they become themselves a legislation. Now, as far as contracting is also concerned, there is an article which provides for at arm's length contracts, but it gives a certain leeway for the local government to meet the standards that are required. But within that, they are, if they are higher by 10% of the value of the contract, that shall be taken. But it is important that at the beginning, pre-qualifications are presented by the contractors. And if a national company cannot be competent enough to enter into those bidding processes, then they have to find ways and means of improving themselves. First, by taking joint ventures with other competent companies in order to be able to participate in those tenders, and then afterwards they can apply by themselves alone. Going back also to the local content in personnel, there are targets and indices. Initially, the targets were 60% after 5 years and 90% after 10 years. But these targets after 13 years has moved. It's now initially 85%. And then 2 years later, it becomes 90%, and 5 years later, it becomes 95%. And I'm glad to say that in the transportation systems and the marine terminals, it's 100% Sudanese rather than any other expat in that employment. In fact, within 5 years of that duration, there were 95% Sudanese in the employment of the Transportation and Marine Terminal Organization charts. Now, I would say the government has made the legislation in the form of an act. Within that act, there is a council which is composed of 6 ministers plus 6 experts. And those are the people who supervise the ministry in implementing the agreements and supervising the operators in those agreements. Now, the operator has to comply with all targets that are imposed on them by the agreement, not by the government or the local authorities for exploration monitoring. It is actually signed by them in the agreement. If they cannot implement that, they have to give reasons to the minister why they cannot. And if those reasons are not acceptable, that the minister can force him to employ, let's say, Sudanese, even if they bring them from abroad on certain contracts that are not normally done in the country. Now, that is very important for us also. Training is important because training in the operating company is to run the operations. But the government has to run its own training requirements. Looking into the future, we aspire to become more like Indonesia when they're in the 90s. Indonesians were actually more competent than the operator personnel, whereby I personally asked their minister there, who was not the minister actually, the Director General of the Oil Corporation there, and I asked him, how do you supervise 90 concessions with 70 companies working in them, and how do you resolve the disputes? He said, we resolve disputes because we are more competent and they agree to our ruling. Now, in order to do that, you have to spend your own time and money to get your peers, people, experts in every region. And I'm not talking about this employing people in the operations. I'm employing people who supervise those operations. And those are in the ministry. And actually, SUDAPET is a part of a contractor. They are not the supervisory element of the company. It is the authority within the ministry. It's the Oil Exploration and Production Authority within the ministry that supervises operations. I think if you can come to me later on any other issue, I'll be gladly. I just want to mention something. It's important that the participation of the local companies in the production of oil is taken further than that, and I maybe would like to ask you if you can go to the internet and look at the Wolfowitz report that was issued during the early time of Senior Bush about the American empire for the next 200 years. Look into the internet and find why. And this is why I look for the national companies not to be participating only, but in the future to go out in order to bring oil to the country. Not talking about money, oil, because in accordance with that report, that then there will come a time when you have the money and you will not be able to buy the energy required. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rahman. And what I took away from your contribution strongly is the need for competent and qualified people to be able to supervise the operations. Once we've gone beyond legislation, you now need the capacity to ensure that the legislation is implemented. Thank you once again. I now turn to the Honorable Deputy Minister, and if you please crave my indulgence, I want you to do 2 things for us today. I would like you to first of all give us an overview of the topic, and I have reserved a particularly juicy question for the Honorable Deputy Minister. And the question that I would want you to address, Honorable, is that local content regulations demand an effective regulatory agency to manage implementation and provide proactive solutions to evolving challenges. However, political interference often weakens institutional effectiveness. How can African countries move away from political interference which promote elite capture to create effective industry regulators? So essentially my question is, the telephone call that comes on a Sunday afternoon to tell somebody in the regulatory authority that you are looking at XYZ, do you know who is behind XYZ? Tread very carefully. How do we as Africans, and I'm deliberately reserved it for a politician, that how do we as Africans, Dr. Amin, if you called the CEO of the Petroleum Commission on a Sunday afternoon with that conversation, how does he ensure that he can tell you that, guys, this is local content? So how do we go about that? So I have two jobs for you, please. One, your general overview, and two, how can we stop people like you calling us on a Sunday afternoon to influence local content? Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Dr. Chumasi. I recall the days we used to banter on issues relating to local content, and being a moderator of this panel tells me that it is not over yet. So, but let me agree that there are many politicians in this room, including CSO politicians, and I believe that we will all be interested in discussing this very important subject of political interference. Legislation is important, there is no doubt about that. But there are countries that have effectively implemented local content without legislation. Trinidad and Tobago and Malaysia are good examples of countries that have achieved greater local content without comprehensive legislation. Even Norway has a non-binding local content framework, and yet has been able to achieve so much in adding value to their economy, leveraging their oil and gas resources. But there are also countries that have comprehensive legislation, and I don't want to mention countries here, that haven't fared well at all as far as local content achievements are concerned. And so yes, legislation is good, but if it is not backed by an enforcement mechanism, by a system that is efficient, by a system that insulates itself from what you call political interference, and if the right setting is not provided, such as providing skills for your people, giving your companies, small, medium scale companies, the capacity to be competitive, you will not be able to achieve local content, in spite of the comprehensive legislation that you have. Why do we need legislation? Now, some of the reasons advanced for enactment of legislation for local content include, among others, eliminating discretion. And the very issue you raised about political interference is one of the major reasons why we have legislation for local content, to eliminate discretion. Now, who often exercise discretion? They are usually political officers, people in political authority, or regulators. And so you need a legislation that will define the scope of decision making on local content issues that come before you as an officer. And so eliminating discretion is one. Another reason we have legislation is to provide the framework for progressively increasing your local participation in the industry. And thirdly, which is also very important, is for purposes of protectionism. If you don't have legislation that bar others coming from foreign sources from participating, then you will not be able to protect your domestic, suppliers and companies. So these are varied reasons why you will provide legislation for local content. But as I said earlier, countries that have such comprehensive legislation to answer these objectives that I have outlined, how are they faring? How have they fared? Are the local industries protected? In most cases, no. Because foreign companies come in different colors, and through local people become dominants of the industry. We've talked so much about fronting. Fronting is real, and they come in different forms. If you have a local company, for instance, that has become a partner in an oil and gas project, they are supposed to meet certain cash call requirements. They are supposed to have some level of capacity to be able to undertake what is assigned them within the partnership. There is a simple way of determining that a company is fronting. For instance, if you look at its recent history of tax payment, and you cannot find records of tax payment, the question you ask yourself is, how did that company come to be able to meet each cash requirement, cash call requirements? But such things are happening. Companies are formed yesterday, but they are partners. And people will say that it is legal. If you set a company today and you are a partner in an oil and gas project, it is legal. You have not broken any law. But the question is, to what extent can we say that you are fronting? We can say that if we do due diligence on your previous track record, if we do due diligence on your tax payment, but I doubt if legislation provides for things like that. Legislation will not do. It would take a proactive regulator, it would take an efficient regulator, it would take a regulator that is insulated from political interference to be able to undertake all this that legislation will not provide for. Another issue that I think is important is that legislation will set targets, but such targets are often not matched with the ability to meet them in the country. And so if you want 5% minimum participation in an oil and gas license, and yet your people do not have the ability, the country doesn't have companies that have the ability to meet this, what do you do? And so government has an important role to play here. And I'll give you many examples of international oil companies that have come to us and complained that they are not finding people as local partners. Because the due diligence they have conducted on local partners, on local companies, show that the local companies are unable to meet their requirements. In the past, a number of local companies were carried. But in an industry that is becoming competitive, you are not likely to get an international oil company carry you. You must be able to meet the requirements on your own strength. But that also has the danger for Ghana. If your legislation says 5% minimum participation and international oil companies are not ready to carry you, there are two implications there. Number one, you don't get your people participate. And number two, your industry is dead. Because if an international oil company doesn't have a local partner, the law will not allow that company to operate. And so are we going to leave the resources in the ground just because we haven't gotten somebody to meet a 5% requirement in a license? On the other hand, are we going to force the companies to take people who cannot meet such requirements? And so the industry is going to die. This is what we are faced with at the moment. So we have adopted a new policy, a policy we call a warehousing policy. What do we mean by that? We carefully examined the requirements of the law. And LI 2204 prescribes that anybody, any entity can be classified as indigenous Ghanaian company except the corporation. And the corporation here refers to GNPC. And so if GNPC is the only company that cannot be classified an indigenous Ghanaian company, then it means that other state companies that have the capacity can be considered. Although many people will think that when you talk about indigenous Ghanaian company, then you are talking about private companies. No, that is not what the law says. And so we are identifying state companies other than the corporation that may have the capacity to participate as indigenous Ghanaian companies and warehouse that requirement of 5% minimum until such a time that they can offload it on the stock exchange or farm out to an indigenous private Ghanaian company when they acquire the capacity. That is the policy that is going to save us. Otherwise, we will not have international oil companies operating in Ghana because they haven't met the requirement. Another thing we are encouraging is for Ghanaians to pool resources. In Ghana, people are too individualistic. We have sole traders who call themselves companies. And you know why they are companies? The man is a director, the wife is a director and secretary. But in reality, they are sole traders who are not qualified. But on the basis of the definition of a company by law, they are qualified. That is what we have. So until we move away from that mentality to a mentality that encourages partnership, pooling resources together, again, we will not be able to meet this requirement, even though it's a legal requirement. And so what I'm driving at is that legislation can both be an enabler, but it can also be a restriction. It can be a stumbling block. So it is important for us to strike a balance, a fine balance, that allows us to meet the objectives of what legislation is aimed at, but at the same time being realistic about what we can achieve in reality. Infrastructure is another. Legislation will not provide infrastructure. Government has to provide the infrastructure. And when I talk about infrastructure, I'm talking about infrastructure that catalyzes local content. There is no way a country can achieve its objective of local content if your focus is just placed on equity participation. Countries will derive value if your effort is focused on value addition and local capability development. But value addition is not going to come by accident. It has to come through a deliberate effort, a deliberate policy by government to facilitate the development of infrastructure that will catalyze value addition. And that is what, as a government, we have decided to do. And for those of you who have followed progress on the Tema Dry Dock and Shipyard, government wants to revive it. We are doing competitive bidding to select a company that will own and manage it and operate it and invest in it, with the view to, in the near future, developing FPSO topside models in Ghana, and in the near future, and I've been discussing this over the past few days with GNPC, be able to have FPSO integration between Ghana and Nigeria. Nigeria has some infrastructure already. Ghana doesn't have. But between the two countries, we can partner to integrate an FPSO in our waters, providing opportunity for most of our people to get jobs, providing an opportunity for value to be added to our economies, providing an opportunity for in-country spend to increase. So that infrastructure is important. Fabrication's capacity is also important. We don't have that much. We should be able to build more fabrication yards. But people tell me, if you build more fabrication yards and you don't have business, what happens? And this is why it's important for Ghana to partner with Nigeria. Nigeria has been able to build an FPSO for Total. And so, given our weak position, option left for us is to increase cooperation with our neighboring country, Nigeria, so that we can leverage their strength to build our own capacity, so that in future we work together to add value to our economies. And so it is important we have legislation, but it is also important that we provide the framework that allows the legislation to work. And by framework, I'm talking about skills for the people, I'm talking about infrastructure, I'm talking about efficient regulator, I'm talking about systems working. And if we do that, I believe, not only Ghana, but many other countries that will adopt these prescriptions will achieve greater successes in the implementation of local content. I believe I have conveniently dodged the question for the politician.
Yes, I see you have, you've done a very good example of the boy who went to write an exam about a forest and he saw a bird. And then he said, I went into a forest and I saw a bird. Therefore, what is a bird? Instead of writing about the forest. So that is what Dr. Amin has conveniently done. He hasn't told us what to do when his phone call comes on a Sunday afternoon. So maybe we'll catch him before he goes. But Dr. Rahman, I think you had a few comments to make. Then I'll cut to you for about 10 minutes and then we can go for tea.
Two issues I think I would like to intercede on them. Number one is that the Sudan does not impose partnerships with any exploration company coming to the Sudan. In fact, the imposition not of private companies but only of Sudapet, who is a national company of the Sudan. And Sudapet is not the regulatory body, but the regulatory body is within the ministry, which is the Exploration and Oil Exploration Production Authority. Number two, in the contracting, also, we do not talk about the oil exploration contracts. When we talk about the regulations in the agreements, we talk about the services contracts, whether they are supply of materials, etc., or construction contracts. And in that also, the regulations are there, the agreements have the articles, but what we do really need to avoid any interference by the maybe the contractor itself, the operator. Example, operator can flout the instructions in the standards and procedures and in the agreement by, for example, delaying the issuance of the bid document and then say, I would like to extend this contract which belongs to his own company. Generally, companies in the Sudan like Petronas and State Petroleum who do not have their own service companies, we don't have any problems with them. The problem is with operators who have their own service companies, and therefore they try all the time to avoid employing the national companies and in favor of their own. From the bidding process until the evaluation and award of the contract, they find the reasons to at least reject the local companies. That is a problem that exists there. Now, in order to avoid that, it's actually the regulations and the supervisory bodies that have to take the responsibility in following each step that is available there. When you make a bidding process, you submit the list of the bidders. And the Sudapet, for example, or the authority can have the right to impose certain contractors, which are generally local contractors, into the bidding process. And whether they are, once they are qualified, then the commercial is also very important in the evaluation there. Sometimes also things happen within that commercial evaluation which need to be supervised better. I'd like to say that the imposition of the local contractors is not in actually doing the work and be able to do it, but in also making the industry indigenous. And I give an example of Abu Dhabi. When Sheikh Zayed was there, his local partners are sleeping partners. Generally, the partners that come from abroad are British, Indian, or otherwise. And he tells them, make your bidding process, reduce it by 10%, and I'd like you instead, when you get that money, I'll give it to you back, but I would like you to make the industry here, build your factories here. Sudan, when they wanted to make the single mooring berth in Port Sudan, they didn't go to Brazil or Italy or ever. They went to Blue Marine in in Abu Dhabi. And I think there are several things that we can match there. I have modified 2 articles, and I'm willing to give to you, which are related to the employment of Sudanese nationals and the contracting, deleted all the reference to Sudanese, and just mentioned a national, and I'll pass them on to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rahman. Thank you for that view from Sudan. Our time is fast spent. I like what the Honorable Deputy Minister was talking about, the fact that we are moving away with just our obsession with equity participation, and we're being creative and more nuanced about how the law should be applied. My boss has told me that I only have 5 minutes left. So I am going to risk his wrath, and then he can meet me outside. We can have a punch-up after this. So I'm just going to throw it to you, because I suspect that there are 1 or 2 people here who are dying to ask questions. So I'm only going to allow 2 minutes. I see Senyor's hand has been up probably since yesterday. So I'm going to allow, this is going to be difficult. I'll shut my eyes and just vote and not vote for my favorites. So we will start with Senor first. And if we can make it very quick, because my boss is giving me very dirty eyes this morning. So please, let's be very quick about it. And then please tell us who the question is addressed to. And no contribution, please. Just a quick, succinct, punchy question, and then we are done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doc, but that makes it quite tricky for me. It has to do with the politics. I think to fix the politics, we have to take the politicians out of our regulatory bodies. We need to first get the boards right. Everybody is particularly partisan, or the appointment is exposed to it. So PC, for example. Why don't we actually have professional institutions rather have representations on our boards? And have politicians just appoint the minority components of the board? Maybe 1 each by the majority and 1 by the minority. The Ghana Bar Association, probably the Institute of Engineers, probably you have the Petroleum Academia. You have institutions that actually now get represented in our regulatory bodies, other than have them political appointees. Our regulator, the CEO, should not be a political appointee. He should apply for his job. His interview should be done in broad daylight. People should apply. We can watch it on GTV, Gavin, and people should earn their place. With that, we are building an institution based on meritocracy. That is what will help sustain us, translate all these beautiful ideas into real substance. Else, like you said, possibly a victim in time past yourself, we are going to end up eroding. Very well, don't comment at all. We are going to end up eroding the good values with all this nice English. And the local content concept, I think Nina or Nima, sorry, forgive me if I didn't mention it, perfect. We sometimes get quite too obsessed with the equity participation. There are all kinds of mechanisms that can be managed, but we should ask ourselves, are we eating into the value chain properly? And how is government reinvesting in other sectors that actually support the value chain? That is totally missing often in our discourse when we talk about local content. And at the end of the day, we retain minimal value. The thinking must change. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the gospel according to Senyor chapter 1 verse 2. Excellent contribution. Even though you broke my rule, I wanted a question, not a contribution. But,
we'll point out later.
Very salient contribution. So, Honorable, that's a ball in your court. No one should be politically appointed. So if you guys can do that, do the interview, and I think Evans will sit on GTV and moderate the interview. On Joy, I beg your pardon, and moderate the interview so that we see what goes on. I'm going to take a second question. So I'm difficult to do doesn't mean that you jettison it. You come to it with a different mindset. The mindset is that, yes, this is the law, and the attitude is, how do we comply? And that was a battle that I've always fought when it comes to local content. You don't come to it and say it's impossible, because the Chinese say that a journey of 1,000 days starts with 1 mile. So you start with your legislation, and then you see how best you can deal with it. But I'll cut to Dr. Amin, because I think there's work afoot to review the LI. So if you can talk about
when I talked about the warehousing policy, I wasn't talking about a foreign company taking that share or stake, if you like. I'm talking about Ghanaian companies. For example, Guel is not noted to be operating in the upstream industry, but Guel has been selected by Exxon as their local partner. One would have expected that a company set up by yourself will be the local partner. And so by warehousing, we asking companies that are traditionally not in the industry, but that have the capacity, the wherewithal to participate and be able to meet the cash calls. But why we also call it warehousing is that Guel, for example, does business which requires it to be liquid at all times, okay? And such companies may not be too open to taking on long-term risk associated with oil and gas exploration and development. And therefore, they're taking it on temporary basis until such a time that they are ready to offload to the stock exchange, so that ordinary Ghanaians like you and I, who buys their shares, can be part owners. Or if there is a private local Ghanaian company that is interested, then Guel can farm out a part to that company. That is the warehousing policy. So it's not going to be held by foreign companies. They are going to be held by Ghanaian companies. But regarding the need to look at the law again, I mean, this is an issue we have discussed over and over, and we all agree that, yes, if the law is not working, there is need to look at it.
Thank you so much. I know there are a lot of other questions on the floor, but I'm sorry, because of our time, what I'll encourage you to do is to catch our discussants during the tea break, and then put to them whatever issue that is bugging you. I want to take this opportunity to welcome Honorable Adam, I think, Mutawakilu, who is the ranking member. He's on the other side of the fence. He's an MP. He's a ranking member for the Mines and Minerals Select Committee in Parliament. Unfortunately, he came too late for me to put my political interference question to him. But no doubt I will catch him during the tea break, and I'll find out what his views are. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. I understand the panelists have closing remarks to make, but if my boss, I'm looking at Evans. So Evans, if you don't allow, I won't watch you on TV again. 1 minute. He says 1 minute, so please don't get me into trouble. Can we start with Neymar? 1 minute each, and then we can close off and then cut to tea. Thank you.
Thank you. For me, what I want to just quickly say is that when we talk about local businesses participating, oftentimes you find that most of the contracts are large contracts, and therefore we tend not to be able to meet the requirements. But we can only meet the requirements if we're willing to partner amongst ourselves. And we have a problem of being selfish, that we don't want to partner amongst ourselves. We want to have the whole cake on our own. But I urge and I beg that all of you here today, we should go on and promote partnerships within local participation to promote and enable them to meet the contract requirements in these industries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Madam Neymar. Doc, if you can just tell us your closing reflections, please.
If you want to preclude political interference, it may not be possible, but there is a way to minimize that by actually setting out the standards and procedures, limits of authority within the petroleum industry, and the personnel to act. In fact, the labor laws in the Sudan will prevent someone like the minister or any political person to remove a person who is very rigid and employing those, or at least supervising those activities. However, they can change the minister who will be able to change those laws again. And this is the only political interference that can take place.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rahman. You have broken my heart. I thought we could do away with political interference, but perhaps I'm being naive. Honorable Deputy Minister, your closing remarks, please.
Yes, two issues. Number one is what I call the clash of local content. And so the Chinese is giving you money to do a project in your country. And it's part of their local content to bring workers from China to work in your country. And so you have local content, they have local content. And so you have the clash of local content. Now we need to move away from local content and use what President Akufo-Addo prefers to use, Ghanaian content. And so you can describe what the Chinese is doing in terms of Chinese content. Wherever they have interest, they must promote Chinese people, Chinese participation, value brought back to China. That is what we also need to do. So in reviewing the local content regulation, it's one issue we may be looking at in terms of broadening beyond the borders of Ghana anytime we're talking about local content. Number two is companies' arguments which they often make, and Boakye mentioned this in his opening statements, that local content leads to cost escalation, it is non-competitive for them. I think that international oil companies that come to operate in Ghana must see local content not as a legal requirement, but as an integral part of their strategy. Because it doesn't make sense to come to a country to operate and you don't expect that country to derive value from what you are doing. And so companies that come in without that strategic, framework of how to partner with the people of Ghana to build their capacity to add value are companies that are not welcome to Ghana. And so let's not see local content as a legal requirement because the legislation has provided for it. But it must be a strategic requirement by every company that wants to partner with our country to develop our resources. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Honorable Deputy Minister. I think on that issue we are not debating it, but there's the issue of petroleum costs. And ultimately, if we were looking at the philosophical underpinnings of local content, you will find that these companies are not spending it. We are actually paying for local content. Because if you look at how petroleum cost is designed, but that's a different debate, not for today. So we'll pick that up on a different day. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me to say thank you to my esteemed panel, Madame Neema Lugangira, Dr. Abdul Rahman, and Honorable Dr. Mohammed Amin Adan. Thank you so much, and my name is Dr. Juliet Chumesi Anoche. Thank you for your time. Now, boss.
Thank you very much, Juliet. Thank you for the panel. And so we're going to take a quick break for cocoa, coffee, and fruit juice outside. And Hausa cocoa as well. That's my favorite, by the way. And so if you wonder what Hausa cocoa is, please see Dr. Juliet. She'll explain to you what that is if you come from Kenya or Sudan. We're supposed to do 15 minutes of break, but we'll do 10 so that we can stay within the time and try and do a lot more. And so 10 minutes break. We'll return for the next session of discussions in an area I'm sure you'll be interested in. See you.